Lecture 77, James Joyce.
"Lazy, idle little loafer," cried the prefect of studies. "Broke my glasses. An old schoolboy trick. Out with your hand, this moment." Stephen closed his eyes and held out in the air his trembling hand with the palm upwards. He felt the prefect of studies touch it for a moment at the fingers to straighten it, and then the swish of the sleeve of the soutane as the pandybat was lifted to strike. A hot, burning, stinging, tingling blow like the loud crack of a broken stick made his trembling hand crumple together like a leaf in the fire. And at the sound and the pain, scalding tears were driven into his eyes. In this vivid passage from the first chapter of his first novel, Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, Joyce recreates from his own experience a moment of searing humiliation and blinding pain. Stephen Dedalus, the fictional counterpart of Joyce himself, is a young boy studying at Clongowes Wood College, a primary school for boarding students run by priests of the Jesuit order about 20 miles west of Dublin. Stephen excels in his schoolwork, but is also a frail and sensitive boy with weak eyesight. Shortly before the beating episode, he has been knocked down on a cinder path by a boy on a bicycle, and his glasses have been shattered. Since he can't see anything clearly until he gets a new pair, the doctor has told him not to read until they arrive, and his Latin teacher has excused him from writing in his theme book with the rest of the class. But Father Dolan, the school disciplinarian, takes no excuses on his visit to the class. When Stephen tells him that he cannot work because his glasses are broken, Father Dolan suspects the boy of playing a trick, and he beats him with a pandybat on each of his palms. For young Stephen, who stands at the top of his class, the beating is not only an ordeal of humiliation and pain, it is also grossly unfair, his first bitter taste of injustice. As such, it calls to mind an episode of the 18th century Confessions of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who writes that he was once mercilessly beaten in childhood for refusing to confess to something that in fact he did not do. But unlike Rousseau, Stephen Dedalus successfully appeals to higher authority. After Father Dolan threatens to beat him again every time he fails to do his lessons, Stephen protests to the rector of the school, who says that he himself will speak to Father Dolan. So Joyce presents his boyhood self as a victim, but a victim capable of speaking up for himself and thus quietly overcoming his tormentors. Joyce's autobiographical novel began its life as an autobiographical essay written on a single day, January 7, 1904. He was born in Rathgar, a suburb of South Dublin, as the eldest child of a property-owning tax collector whose fiscal irresponsibility gradually reduced his large family to poverty and debt. Nevertheless, partly through his own success in winning prizes and scholarships, Joyce gained a very good education under Jesuit priests at the same school that Stephen attends, right up through University College, where he first clearly showed his literary gifts. After graduation, he took up book reviewing for a Dublin newspaper, spent a few months in Paris, and came back to a gravely sick mother who died in August of 1903. On the following January 7, while still living in the family home, Joyce wrote the autobiographical essay that became the germ of his first novel over a period of many years. Rewritten first as a bulky, unfinished story of 26 chapters called Stephen Hero, it was then cut and reshaped into 5 long chapters. And in 1916, it was finally published under the title it has borne ever since, Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. Meanwhile, Joyce had settled in Europe with a young woman from Galway named Nora Barnacle, whom he had met on a Dublin street in June of 1904. He picked her up, in fact. They eloped to the continent 4 months later, and the following year they settled in Trieste, Italy, where Joyce eked out a living by teaching English, and where he and his family spent most of the next 10 years. During that time, he not only finished his work on Portrait of the Artist, he also saw into print a volume of poetry, chamber music, in 1907, and he completed the stories that appeared in a book called Dubliners in 1914. By then, he had started work on his second and most famous novel, Ulysses, which was published in Paris on February 2nd, 1922, his 40th birthday. Ulysses is a landmark in literature, one of the greatest novels of all time. But since I've already explored that novel in another set of teaching company lectures, I'm going to spend the rest of this one on Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. This autobiographical first novel not only establishes one of the three leading characters of Ulysses, it also introduces us to the life and artistry of Joyce himself. In short, it's the story of the making of a novelist. Just about 100 years earlier, in a long autobiographical poem called The Prelude, Wordsworth tells a comparable story, the story of how he came to be a poet. Reaching back to his earliest memories, Wordsworth takes us from his infancy into his 20s, when the dawn of his poetry coincided with the outbreak of the French Revolution. Starting likewise with the author's childhood, Joyce's portrait tells how he made himself a writer just as Ireland was struggling to free itself from the British Empire. Both men feel ambivalent toward political upheaval. Wordsworth is thrilled by the outbreak of the French Revolution, but lives to deplore its headlong violence. Joyce resents British imperialism, but distrusts Irish nationalism, and he communicates that distrust through the voice of his fictional self, Stephen Dedalus. Unlike Wordsworth, in fact, Stephen breathes no patriotic fervor for his native land. As the mythic son of the fabulous winged artificer of ancient Crete, Stephen Dedalus seeks a deeply personal kind of freedom. He yearns to fly beyond what he calls the nets of nationality, language, and religion, an Irish nation dominated by Catholic priests and isolated by the Irish tongue. Though raised as a Roman Catholic and steeped in its doctrines, Joyce himself renounced his allegiance to the Catholic Church at about the age of 19. Stephen does likewise. Not even to please his mother will he perform his Easter duty by confessing his sins and taking Holy Communion at Easter time. Instead, echoing the words that Satan supposedly used to launch his rebellion against the authority of God, Stephen roundly declares, "Non serviam, I will not serve." So Joyce's story of Stephen Dedalus closely follows the main events of Joyce's own early life. But Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man is not just a record or chronicle of Joyce's early life. To see how Joyce reworks the facts about that life, consider something that actually happened to him just after he turned 7. According to the punishment book at Clongowes Wood College, the 7-year-old James Joyce was struck with a pandy bat 4 times on his open palms for using vulgar language. Now, this could be seen as a defining moment in Joyce's early life. Punished for using dirty words, he would grow up to test and stretch the limits of what can be published, especially in Ulysses, which for years was banned in England and America because it was said to be pornographic. But Joyce's boyhood flaunting of naughty words finds no place in Portrait. Why not, you ask? Because in this novel, the boy called Stephen must embody innocence. Delicate of frame, delicate of speech, he is pained even by such mildly indecorous words as rump. The Stephen created by Joyce would not dream of using vulgar language, and he scarcely resembles the strong, spunky athlete that Joyce himself proved to be in his youth. Small, weak, and vulnerable, Stephen hovers on the fringes of the football players, afraid of their rough feet. He's a sensitive child, beset by foul-mouthed brutes and bullies like Nasty Roach and Wells, who pushed him into the slimy water of the cesspool in a grotesque parody of baptism. This sharp contrast between young Stephen and Joyce himself tells us something important about the shape and meaning of the novel. The story Joyce constructs from the material of his early life requires a boyhood of sensitive, vulnerable innocence, a boyhood in which he is cruelly punished by a tyrannical priest, then quietly triumphs over injustice, and eventually becomes a young man bold enough to declare his intellectual independence and his burning ambition to forge in the smithy of my soul the uncreated conscience of my race. Now, this is a tall order, of course. But like the ancient prophets, and like Wordsworth again, who thought himself singled out to speak as a prophet for his time, like the ancient prophets and like Wordsworth, Stephen feels that he alone has been chosen for this great artistic mission. Solitude is Stephen's trademark. Though Joyce himself had a number of friends and a highly literate younger brother who practically worshipped him, the brother scarcely appears in this novel, and the friends become adversaries, not confidants. Stephen cannot make or find a home anywhere, least of all with his parents and siblings. Near the end of chapter 2, we read, "He felt that he was hardly of the one blood with them, but stood to them rather in the mystical kinship of fosterage, foster child, and foster brother." This kind of language suggests what Sigmund Freud calls the family romance. The child's belief that he or she descends from royal or noble parents who have been displaced by ordinary figures, foster parents. Stephen has little respect for his biological father, who comes across as pathetic and self-important, a bankrupt living off inflated memories of his past. So Portrait tells the story of how Stephen gradually turns from his biological father to his mythic father Daedalus, the legendary artisan of ancient Crete, maker of wings. Because Stephen likewise yearns to fly by means of his art, he cannot submit himself to any kind of institutional order. In chapter 4, he rededicates himself to the Catholic Church after plunging into sex with a prostitute. But he can never relinquish his sense of himself as a being apart. To merge his life in the common tide of other lives, we read, was harder for him than any fasting or prayer, unquote. In the same chapter, Stephen wonders what his life would be like if he became a Jesuit priest, if he joined the Jesuit order. But he knows that, quote, his destiny was to be elusive of social or religious orders. The whole passage prompts us to think about the various meanings of the word order. It can, of course, mean a particular society of priests bound together by common vows. It can also signify a set of regulations or simply a command that must be obeyed. Thus, the word epitomizes everything that Stephen rejects, insofar as he might be asked to submit himself to any order conceived by someone else. But Stephen does not reject all order. He is not a mindless rebel against regulation of any kind. On the contrary, as an artist in the making, he seeks to find or create an order of his own. Because he resolutely seeks to create an order of his own and make his own way on his own uncompromising terms, Stephen strikes his classmates as an antisocial being. He will not join any group or support any cause, no matter how noble it may seem. When a petition for universal peace circulates among the students, Stephen will not sign it. And one of his friends, a country boy named Davin, who has signed it, is dismayed by Stephen's refusal to do so. "You're a terrible man, Stevie," he says, "always alone." But in spite of his aloofness, Stephen keenly observes those around him. "Now that you have signed the petition for universal peace," he says to Davin, "I suppose you will burn that little copybook I saw in your room." Unquote. The copybook is the secret drill book of the Fenians, originally called the Irish Revolutionary Brotherhood, a group of militant Irish nationalists founded in 1859 and bent on the violent overthrow of British rule. Stephen thus catches Davin in a contradiction, signing a petition for peace even while training himself to fight for nationalism. But if Stephen won't sign the petition for peace, why isn't he himself joining this fight? What sort of hero is this character who is actually called Stephen Hero in the original version of this book? And why isn't he learning the Irish language, as Davin goes on to ask him, so as to play his part in the revival of Irish culture, in the cultural liberation of Ireland from England? At the end of the 19th century, the mere act of studying the Irish language was political. In the middle of the 19th century, the British had tried to stamp out the Irish language altogether, and children were punished for speaking it in school. So in the 1890s, Irish patriotic groups adopted Sinn Féin, meaning we ourselves, as their motto for a movement to revive Irish culture. And in 1905, Arthur Griffith took this name for a political movement that is still fighting for complete independence of Ireland to this very day. Why then won't Stephen join even the cultural fight for independence from Britain? It's because Stephen won't join anything at all, in part. but mainly because he knows only too well what Ireland has done to its champions, to those who fought for its independence in the past, especially Charles Stewart Parnell. Born in 1846 as the son of a Protestant landowner, Parnell became the leader of the Irish Party in the British Parliament and a champion of Irish Home Rule, widely regarded as the uncrowned King of Ireland. But in 1889, news of an affair with a married woman named Kitty O'Shea led the Catholic priests of Ireland to denounce him. Hounded out of office, he died a broken man in 1891, when Joyce was 9 years old, just old enough to grasp the impact of his death. Over Christmas dinner in the very first chapter of Portrait, little Stephen hears a fierce argument about Parnell between Dante Riordan, the children's governess, and John Casey, a family friend. When Dante calls Parnell a traitor to his country and insists the priests were right to abandon him, that the priests were always the true friends of Ireland, Casey cites one example after another to show how the Catholic Church has repeatedly undermined Ireland's struggle for independence and betrayed its champions. Casey's thrilling speech makes an indelible impression on little Stephen. So when Davin asks him why he won't join the fight for Irish independence, Stephen echoes Casey's words. Looking back to Wolfe Tone, who was captured in the abortive rebellion of 1798, Stephen says, "No honorable and sincere man has given up to you his life and his youth and his affections from the days of Tone to those of Parnell, but you sold him to the enemy, or failed him in need, or reviled him and left him for another. And you invite me to be one of you. I'd see you damned first." Then Stephen adds, "Do you know what Ireland is? Ireland is the old sow that eats her farrow." Ireland, in other words, devours her own children, especially those who fight for its freedom. Bitter as it is, this scathing denunciation, interestingly enough, might be compared to the words of Saint Stephen, the first Christian martyr for whom Joyce's Stephen is named. Appointed by the apostles to care for the widows of Greek-speaking Jews in Jerusalem, Saint Stephen, was arrested by the Jewish elders for preaching on behalf of Christ. Speaking in his own defense, Stephen argued that the Jewish people had repeatedly rejected and ignored the words of their own prophets, including even Moses, and that they had now betrayed Christ. For saying this, Stephen is dragged out of the city and stoned to death. So the name of Stephen calls to mind not just the first Christian martyr, but also a man of eloquence, a man who dared to criticize his own people, the Jewish people, for betraying their own prophets. Joyce's Stephen is himself a martyr of sorts, as we have seen. But in this novel, we also see him becoming a man of eloquence, who will dare to reveal to Ireland the truth about itself in all its bitterness and beauty. To accomplish this task, Stephen must master English, the language of Ireland's master, and his lessons begin with the very first words of the novel. "Once upon a time, and a very good time it was, there was a moo cow coming down along the road." These are the words of a story read aloud to Stephen by his father. So the very first thing that Stephen experiences is the words of a story. Language instantly takes a privileged place in Stephen's world. And the first thing he remembers doing is using language, using it in song. When he hears a song about the wild rose blossoms on the little green place, he sings, "Oh, the green wolf botheth." Notice what happens here. He's lisping, of course, but he's also composing something new by rearranging the words that he's just heard, taking the green from the place and attaching it to the roses. Later on, remembering this song about the wild rose blossoms, Stephen tells himself, "But you could not have a green rose." And then he adds, "But perhaps somewhere in the world you could." And that somewhere, of course, is the imagination. Gifted with a powerful imagination, Stephen uses language and colors to create a world around him. Finding a picture of the earth in the midst of clouds on the first page of his geography book, he colors the earth green and the clouds maroon, and then reads what he has written on the flyleaf of his book, his name and cosmic address, from Class of Elements at Clongowes Wood College to the universe. Like all of us in childhood, Stephen sees the universe not as heliocentric or geocentric, but rather me-ocentric, a world revolving around himself. In the life of the mind, anything is possible. And in this story of Stephen's life, language and reality become one. By themselves, words can be menacing or frightening, as when Father Dolan calls him a lazy, idle little loafer, or he sees the word fetus cut into a desk of the anatomy theater at his father's old school, or the priest at the retreat evokes in glowing color the torments of hell. Besides frightening Stephen, words sometimes mystify him. Knowing that Protestants like to ridicule the epithets used for the Virgin Mary, such as Tower of Ivory and House of Gold, Stephen asks himself, how could a woman be a Tower of Ivory or a House of Gold? Who was right then? But one day Stephen learns the answer by observing a girl named Eileen who lives near him. Eileen, he sees, had long, thin, cool white hands because she was a girl. They were like ivory, only soft. That was the meaning of Tower of Ivory, but Protestants could not understand it and made fun of it. One day he had stood beside her looking into the hotel grounds. She had put her hand into his pocket where his hand was, and he had felt how cool and thin and soft her hand was. And then all of a sudden she had broken away and had run laughing down the sloping curve of the path. Her fair hair had streamed out behind her like gold in the sun. Tower of Ivory, House of Gold. By thinking of things, you could understand them. By looking at people, places, and things through the window of language, or in this case through the framework of metaphor, Stephen comes to grasp both language and the world around him. But there's more than metaphor and virginity at work in the passage I just quoted. Though Eileen's ivory hands and her golden hair suggest epithets used for the Virgin Mary, she puts her hand into Stephen's pocket, a potentially erotic gesture. This gesture subtly initiates a process whereby Stephen's reverence for the Virgin gradually gives way to his fascination with the whore, with sexual violation and transgression of purity, with lust. The prospect of sexual experience stirs in Stephen a paradoxical combination of feelings. At the end of chapter 2, he is aroused by lust, and yet also envisions the moment of sexual intercourse as a holy encounter, wherein weakness and timidity and inexperience were to fall from him. Paradoxically, he foresees the loss of his own innocence, of his own virginity, as a sacred rite of initiation. At the same time, he sees himself as a sexual aggressor, wanting to force another into sinning with him. Yet even as he imagines taking a woman by force, he feels himself sexually invaded. Quote, he felt some dark presence moving irresistibly upon him from the darkness, a presence subtle and murmurous as a flood, filling him wholly with itself. Its subtle streams penetrated his being. His hands clutched convulsively and his teeth set together as he suffered the agony of its penetration. The sense of himself as a passive, virginal object of lust becomes even more explicit in his first encounter with a prostitute, where he simply allows himself to be taken and kissed like a child nestling in the arms of his mother. He closed his eyes, we read, surrendering himself to her, body and mind, conscious of nothing in the world but the dark pressure of her softly parting lips. Now, if you compare this ending of chapter 2 with the endings of chapters 1 and 3, you can see how all three chapters fit together. Chapter 1 establishes the innocence of Stephen, which is vindicated when he appeals to the rector. In chapter 2, he falls into lust, but in chapter 3, he is spiritually revived by the retreat, a program of prayer and preaching highlighted by a hair-raising sermon on the punishments of hell and the torments of the damned. At the end of this chapter 3, Stephen confesses his sins to a priest and takes communion. He thus reaffirms his faith in God and in the purity of the Virgin Mary. He renounces the bestiality of stinking, goatish lust and returns to the faith, to the order and embrace of Roman Catholicism. So, in its first three chapters, Portrait of the Artist gives us innocence, sin, repentance, and reconciliation to God. This sequence roughly recapitulates the pattern of traditional evangelical narratives, such as the Confessions of St. Augustine, who had his own wild bouts of teenage sex in the fleshpots of ancient Carthage before turning to Christianity. But Joyce's novel evokes this traditional pattern only to break it in pieces. For what follows Stephen's taking of communion at the end of chapter 3 is the story of how he comes to renounce his faith in the Catholic Church, the very church to which he has returned. In chapter 3, you see, he unleashes the full force of Jesuit eloquence in a series of sermons on hell calculated to terrify anyone who heard them. And then, as if to demonstrate his own power to resist that eloquence, he ends up saying, "Non serviam, I will not serve." Stephen cannot serve the order of religion, cannot follow its rituals, cannot heed the rules of any society or the regulations of any institution. As I've said already, he must create an order of his own, which is the order of his art. Roman Catholics believe that at the moment of consecration in the Mass, the priest turns bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ. Turning this ritual into metaphors for artistic creation, Stephen yearns to be, quote, a priest of the eternal imagination, transmuting the daily bread of experience into the radiant body of ever-living life. A striking example of this transmutation comes at the end of chapter 4, where Stephen catches sight of a solitary girl wading in the sea. Unlike the prostitute of chapter 2, she does not rouse him sexually. Instead, Stephen sees her through a veil of metaphor as a strange and beautiful seabird. Her ivory thighs and slate blue skirts compose a mortal version of the Virgin Mary, and thus complete the circle initiated by the movement of Eileen's ivory hand into his pocket. For Stephen, this idealized figure is an object not of lust, but of enraptured contemplation. She provokes in him what he later calls an aesthetic or static emotion, wherein the mind is arrested and raised above desire and loathing. His imagination thus transmutes the girl, the daily bread of experience, into something transcendent. Taking the priest and the consecration as his model for a new religion of art, Stephen clearly shows that he has been supersaturated with Catholicism. But as I've already indicated, Stephen's mythic father is the ancient and legendary artisan for whom he is named, Daedalus, maker of the Cretan labyrinth and of the wings with which he flew out of it when he was trapped inside with a raging bull. Near the end of chapter 4, Stephen walks out to North Bull Island, here called simply the Bull, and finds a number of other boys swimming and shouting his name. Now, as never before, we read, his strange name seemed to him a prophecy. Now, at the name of the fabulous artificer, he seemed to hear the noise of dim waves and to see a winged form flying above the waves and slowly climbing the air. What did it mean? Was it a prophecy of the end he had been born to serve and had been following through the mists of childhood and boyhood, a symbol of the artist forging anew in his workshop out of the sluggish matter of the earth, his own soaring, impalpable, imperishable being? Joyce's answer to this question is a resounding yes. Daedalus symbolizes Stephen's aspiration to soar, his yearning to fly beyond what he calls the nets of religion, nationality, and language. At the same time, Daedalus exemplifies Stephen's ambition to create a world of words, or as he says at the end, to forge the uncreated conscience of his race. In the final words of the novel, where third-person narrative gives way to first-person diary entries, Stephen nearly merges with Joyce himself. Just as Daedalus built the labyrinth of Crete, Joyce will soon set himself the task of recreating the labyrinth of Dublin in Ulysses. Having begun with a picture of his biological father, and then progressed to all the religious fathers who educate and discipline him, he ends by invoking his mythical father, the father of the identity he has discovered within himself. Old father, old artificer, stand me now and ever in good stead. At the end of Portrait, Stephen is far from a full-fledged artist. He is an aesthete living in a world of beautiful words, and to forge the conscience of his race, he sorely needs to grapple with the material, physical facts of life and death. But if Ulysses may be called an epic as well as a novel, the final words of Portrait turn the whole of Portrait into an invocation, a prayer for the inspiration that Joyce will need to write his masterpiece.